Towards the end of the article, in its conclusions, the authors note some future areas of research, both following this paper but mostly to supplement this research. These focus on promoting healthy questioning of socio-economic outcomes of factors that have heavy shares in increasing economic growth and development. To paraphrase the article, the authors illustrated the possibility of future academics engaging in research that examine the interconnected variables through which all the pillars of sustainability can be further strengthened and may result in holistic socio-economic development of countries largely reliant on growth of tourism sector. Furthermore, using our own judgment and knowledge of the topic area, we believe that further areas of research could include calculating and estimating sustainable levels of pollution in this region going into the future and how these might affect further sustainability outcomes of these economies if policy suggestions are not taken into consideration. Moreover, some other research opportunities that would assist in similar motivations to this study could include policy implications of economic and simultaneous environmental policy, also studying policies in different regions and economic climates across the world, if they've worked, why they've worked, and why or why not they would work for other nations, especially growing and developing nations in the ASEAN region that may face environmental degradation linked with the tourism industry. To cross-discipline slightly with a greater focus on the environment, further research to what already exists could explore other industries that drive economic growth and GDP and their correlation with environmental degradation and how this is reducing quality of life for future generations. Lastly, to really broaden the research area, other social and economic outcomes of increases in growth in GDP such as employment generation, infrastructure establishment, tourism-related value chain development, and through other socio-economic impacts on the lives of domestic populations could be analysed to capitalise on some of these positive externalities and really improve quality of life indicators overall around the world. The main objective of this study is to examine the effect of tourist arrivals on environmental pollution caused by carbon dioxide emissions in Malaysia, Thailand, and Singapore over the period of 1990 to 2014. Therefore, we believe that the question that this article aims to address is to what extent tourism and economic development and growth affects environmental outcomes, pollution and degradation, and whether there is a negative or positive correlation between the two variables in Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand. In other words, the question addresses and focuses on what impact tourism has on environmental pollution in tourism-led economies in Southeast Asia.
The study uses World Development Indicators from Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand from 1990 to 2014 in order to determine the impact of tourism on environmental pollution. The study uses CO2 emissions per capita in metric tonnes as the variable in comparison to the total number of arrivals in the host country per year. The study uses the fully modified ordinary least squared regression approach, or FMOLS for short, to measure the impact of tourism on CO2 emissions along with control variables. The study then applied the Zibot's-Andrew approach in order to examine the order of integration of these variables. This method is effective at detecting the potential structural break that could possibly occur from 1990 to 2014. A critique of the methodology used is that it does not encompass the entire scope of environmental pollution and degradation caused by visiting tourists. For example, a study in 2009 called The Effect of Tourism on Water Quality and Coral Reef Communities explained tourism's negative impacts on water pollution in Thailand. The research revealed strong gradients in water quality and biotic characteristics associated with tourism concentration levels, as well as seasonal variability. Water and reef quality decreased with a proportionate increase in tourism influx. Tourism's negative effects on the quality of air is the only factor of environmental degradation that the analysis hopes to uncover. The other forms of environmental degradation that are not taken into account include deforestation, overconsumption of natural resources, and overfishing, to name a few. The impact of overconsumption, for example, is a major factor that is not contemplated in the study. With increased tourist influx, it is shown that a greater strain on the water supply and natural food stocks occurs. The analysis does well in outlining tourism's effects on CO2 levels while accounting for variables. However, However, other forms of pollution and degradation must be taken into account to get a whole picture of tourism's effects on the environment. The environmental Kuznets curve in this study is used as a base to assess the operating environment in the countries in question. The Kuznets curve implies that as a nation undergoes industrialization and a nation's economy shifts from rural agricultural lands and into cities due to the presence of higher paying jobs in the city centre, a natural wealth gap begins to form. In the context of environmental pollution and degradation, the environmental Kuznets curve claims that as an economy develops their ability to combat pollution, a negative parabola effect occurs. As the tourism population rises, so does GDP until we reach a turning point when the total level of pollution drops as an economy has a better ability to combat the negative externalities of tourism-driven growth. The results of this study give in part conclusive evidence to support the hypothesis that underpins the environmental Kuznets curve. In the case of Malaysia and Thailand, the environmental Kuznets curve hypothesis is valid as when in reference to GDP, because in the FMOLS estimator, it's shown that variable GDP is positively and significantly associated with CO2 emissions, whereas the inverse GDP square is negatively and significantly associated with CO2 emissions, which makes the environmental Kuznets curve hypothesis valid. In the case of Singapore, the hypothesis does not hold as GDP is positively and insignificantly associated with CO2 emissions, when GDP square is negatively and significantly associated with CO2 emissions. The results from Malaysia and Thailand clearly explain that their developing economies still have room to grow. Their current inability to combat the effects of tourist-driven pollution is because they sit at the left side of the negative parabola. As their economies grow, their ability to combat the effects of pollution will overtake the actual pollution levels occurring, and the decrease in the overall CO2 emissions from these tourist-driven economies would decrease. In the case of Singapore, the environmental Kuznets curve could not be deemed valid as the GDP variable was insignificantly associated with CO2 emissions. This could be due to Singapore's mature status as a developed nation. Their potential for GDP growth has reached a plateau, whereas in Malaysia and Thailand, GDP growth has significantly more room to grow.
With the enormous contribution of tourism to the GDP of developing and small island nations and relatively significant contribution to developed nations, it is important to assess tourism's correlations to other economic and social outcomes. Some of these outcomes can include employment generation, infrastructure establishment, tourism-related value chain development, and other socio-economic outcomes that impact the lives of domestic populations. The motivations for this article seem to be to raise awareness of the impact that tourism can have on the environment in the form of pollution and degradations, namely its correlation between these environmental outcomes and economic growth and development. Another point of awareness that this article aims to address is also the growing need to push for environmental pollution policies. The article states that the broad aim of this study is to explore the effect of tourism on environmental pollution for 3 ASEAN countries that thereby reduce their contextual knowledge gap and further advance pedagogic insight on tourism and environmental pollution. This gap also includes raising awareness of efficient energy usage and CO2 reduction policies. Other underlying motivations and purposes of this article that could be present include further testings of the environmental Kuznets curve hypothesis that presents a negative parabolic relationship between environmental degradation and per capita income. In short, the hypothesis of the curve says that countries with the lowest per capita incomes have rising environmental degradation as their incomes rise, but once this per capita income reaches a certain point, as incomes rise further, environmental degradation reduces.
The environmental Kuznets curve. No?
No!
Why not?